I was a big fan growing up of John Denver. And John Denver said the best songwriter alive is John Prine. So I started listening to John Prine because of John Denver. 1987, I guess, I came down to the Bluebird Cafe because I wanted to see what the Writers' Nights were all about. And I went in and I watched the show, came out, and it was pouring down rain. And this vintage restored car pulls up. Out hops John Prine. And he runs up to the sidewalk in the pouring rain under those awnings and starts talking to me. And he sits there and smokes a cigarette. Must have been 15 or 20 minutes, standing there with a complete stranger talking to me. It was the coolest thing ever. You know, so encouraging, so nice, so normal. Years later, of course, when I worked with Nanci Griffith, I got to spend a little bit of time with him because he and Nanci were really good friends. And during the Other Voices, Other Rooms record she did, I got to spend a little time with him. But yeah, John, you know, and then you would see him out, and I don't know if he ever knew who I was, but he acted like he did. You know, he was so around town. Well, Nanci, I was her publicist through her. I was, I guess, publicity liaison when I was at management, dealing with the record labels on her behalf, scheduling interviews with her directly, things like that. So when I saw the excuse to go into the studio and watch her work, who wouldn't take that? Especially on something like Other Voices, Other Rooms, you know, where she was bringing in all these great guys. And they did it over at Jack's Tracks, which was Jim Rooney produced it. But when I first became a songwriter in town, Jim was my publisher. And idiot me, I didn't realize what I had there. So the minute somebody started waving a weekly draw, you know, I went to that instead of staying with Jim. Stupid me. Because I love Jim Rooney. He was such an amazing, and is, an amazing guy. To be in the same room with somebody like that. You know, it was him and Alan Reynolds, who went on to produce Garth Brooks, of course. I had worked for the newspaper, for the Nashville Banner, as a correspondent. And I don't know if you know this, you probably do, but you can't make money as a journalist. Certainly not now, but even then it was hard. And I went to the Bluebird one night, and I was back at the bar, and I met a girl named Diana Johnson, who was the vice president at Country Music Hall of Fame. And she said, you should call Liz Thiels and see if she has any openings for a publicist. So I called Liz, and lo and behold, she had an opening, and she hired me that same day, which was wonderful. And we represented Reba McEntire, Nanci Griffith, Charlie Daniels, Ralph Emery, Newgrass Revival, Ricky Van Shelton, did I say Charlie Daniels? It was a nice roster. Liz was one of the first people in town that made PR for entertainers, that was her whole goal, was PR for entertainers. She also, sorry to go off on these tangents, but Liz was also one of the principals at the First Exit Inn, which was legendary, period. I think she and Owsley Minear were there. And so I met Nanci then. My first client there was Newgrass Revival. And Newgrass, or that was my day-to-day responsible client. And Newgrass and Nanci were managed by the same company, Vector Management. So I just kind of, after a year with Network Inc., I went over to Vector Management and worked for Ken and Dan Goodman. Yeah, it was great. I spent 10 years there with them. Nanci was there that whole time.
Like, where was Nanci at in her life right then?
That was, I think she had that was at the end of the Rounder days. I think she had, I believe, if I'm not mistaken, we were working on the Lone Star State of Mind record when I was at Network Inc. So her first MCA record. And of course, when I got to Ken's, you know, she followed, I guess, with 4 or 5 other MCA records over the years. Yeah. She was, you know, Nanci was an amazing talent as a writer. I learned a lot watching her perform. She's, she kind of had it down to an art. Of course, Nanci wrote brilliant songs. One thing I noticed, we're working with people like Nanci and Lyle and Joe Ely and guys like that, is they don't write complicated songs. That's the art of what they do. They may be insightful, but it doesn't make them complicated. And I think Nanci was that way. Love at the Five and Dime, you just think you're listening to a little story that, wow, what a song that is. What a lyric. Kind of crazy. Disgusting, really, that somebody can write that well. I was a big fan of hers before I ever met her. I remember seeing her one night talking about how she had written Love at the Five and Dime, and I never heard her tell this again, but it seemed like she said she was at this songwriter festival or something. They were all supposed to perform a song about a musician. And she said she didn't have one, so she stayed up all night writing that song. And she showed up, and she was the only one that had one. And it was Love at the Five and Dime. I only heard her tell that once. So, it was Jenny, when I was at Network Inc., Jenny Bowler, who incidentally was the very first music business person I ever met, long before I even moved to Nashville. But I ended up working at the same company she was in. She represented Nanci. And when we were there, I remember Nanci playing Carnegie Hall for the first time. That was a big, big deal. And of course, when I was at Vector, Nanci's European presence exploded. She was in, Letterman loved to have Nanci on. Every time we asked.
He's got great taste in music.
Has great taste in music. And he loved Nanci. I think it even got to where she would go sit down and talk to him, which is kind of unusual. I've always heard that Letterman was really, and I know this is true, he's kind of standoffish with musicians because he is so enamored by them. That's what I've always heard. I've never met him. I've been to the show before, but he keeps a distance.
Yeah. Well, when you are working a Guy record, what are the outlets that you're trying to, that would actually be open to him? What would be...
At the time, big publications, big outlets were open to Guy. It was not uncommon that you'd get a feature on Guy in Rolling Stone. It was not uncommon that you'd get a review in Time magazine. That was not uncommon. That music. I don't know what's happened, because all of a sudden in the past, maybe 15 years, and I guess maybe it has to do with the folding of all the newspapers and that people don't read like they used to. And it seems like every time I turn around, there's a lack of respect being given to musicians from those same publications that used to celebrate them. They have no interest in them anymore, and I don't understand that.
Are there different writers?
Absolutely.
'Cause I remember there were certain writers in certain publications when I was much younger that if they said something was great, I went and bought it.
Dave Marsh. One of the, and by the way, an unbelievably nice guy. Unbelievable. Now, I know some superstar journalists that are not nice. Anthony Curtis was always really nice to me. I've told 2 journalists in my career to shove it. I told Robert Christgau and Nat Hentoff they were assholes and life was too short for people like them. And I never dealt with them again. Now, I'm sure I hung up the phone and woo, I hate that. They didn't care. But, for the most part, journalists of that period were, like Dave Marsh. He said something, I believed him. Well, before I worked at Network Inc., I was the editor of a newspaper over in Mount Juliet, Tennessee, the Mount Juliet Chronicle. And that's Charlie's. You know, that was his home. And so anytime there was a benefit, he would ask us to come cover it, or if there was an event, we would cover it. And it's so funny. The first time I ever met him, I went to cover an event as the editor. And afterward, when you work for a little newspaper, you carry your own camera, your notepad and your camera. And after the event, all these people were wanting me to take pictures of them with Charlie. And I guess I was 25 or 26 at the time, not as heavy as I am now. And I got home and I had a roommate, and I said, man, those people, they just wanted their picture made with Charlie Daniels. Can you believe that? They just acted so stupid trying to get his picture. My roommate said, well, did you get a picture? Well, yeah. And for years, my mom and dad kept a picture of me with Charlie Daniels, and I'm just this skinny kid and Charlie's there with his big old cowboy hat. Before he died, I took my youngest son, and I can't believe it. My oldest son used to go everywhere with me to a lot of different events. And I finally took my son, Logan, well, I guess he was about 24, 25. I took him out to the Grand Ole Opry backstage, and Charlie was there. And he's got a picture of him and Charlie Daniels, which he loves. Yeah. Charlie was always a really pleasant guy to deal with, too. We differed quite a bit politically, but he was always a real gentleman. He really was. Well, I guess that would have been... he was still doing volunteer jam because we covered, my PR company covered this volunteer jam out at Starwood, the big amphitheater here, and they brought in a lot of big artists. I can't remember if Don Henley was on that year or not, but that was when Don Henley had left the Eagles. Would that have been, in the 87 maybe, 86, 87? Well, the funny thing about that was that we had a team of publicists from our office that were, covering all the press there. And the funny thing there was Charlie had his volunteer jam the same weekend as the Jerry Lewis telethon. And so they were going to broadcast from Starwood. And Jerry Lewis's people were there. And they dressed just like him. It was 200 degrees outside, and they were wearing these jackets, and they had their hair slicked back like Jerry did at that time. It was really weird. It was really, really weird.
Did he have a uniform for him?
Well, I guess so. I guess he did, yeah. And they all laughed like him. No. They seemed very out of place because, with Charlie, his guys, dress a little more casually. Yeah, that was funny. They had this little pop-up that they sat out in the audience, and they just sat out there just roasting in that heat. It does kind of tie together because I came to town wanting to be a songwriter. John Prine was my first big star I ever met that ever had any conversation with me at all. So that was real encouraging. I started seeing guys like Don Schlitz and Tom Schuyler. That was eye-opening because I thought, I'll come to Nashville and I'll write songs. Country music's so easy to write. And I saw all those guys, and as you know, it's not easy to write a good country song. It's really tough. And so I had a lot of learning to do. And then somehow I end up thrown in as a publicist with who I consider some of the best songwriters on the planet. I've always kept my songwriting and my PR separate. Like when I was working with Steve Warner, I never said, Steve, here's a song of mine. I never liked when people in the industry did that. That somehow just there's an ick factor. Let them find out for themselves if they like what I do or not. So I never talked about it. I don't think Joe Ely knew I had written a song till a few years ago. And I've been with him nearly 40 years. It's a different level. I see people all the time who take their positions and try and turn it into a songwriting career for themselves or recording. That gives me the creeps, you know. But now, having said that, the first artist I was ever responsible for representing was Newgrass Revival. And, you know, Sam Bush, Bela Fleck, Pat Flynn, John Cowan. And I loved those guys. You know, personally, musically, what's not to love? So when it came time for me to record a set of songs, the guy who was producing it said, well, you know Sam, you know Pat. And I said, well, I'm not calling them. And he did. And they, you know, they didn't hesitate. They came in and recorded these with me. I tell you, on my record, there's a couple of tracks, like Sound of My Home on there, at the end of it, where it's fading out, Sam's playing. I get chill bumps listening to it. And it's like, oh my God, that's my song. How is it? Sam Bush playing on my song, and he's playing that. You know, I've been a fan of Dan Dugmore's since I started listening to James Taylor and Linda Ronstadt. I met Dan because he needed a record promoted. He did an album called the Off-White Record. I don't know if you ever heard it, but it's a beautiful collection of pedal steel guitar versions of the Beatles songs. It's beautiful. The deal with Danny was, if I would promote that, he'd help me with some demos. Well, he produced 3 or 4 songs for me, and became a friend. And so, you know, I've got songs that the only instrument besides me playing the guitar and singing is Dan. One of my songs, he plays everything, including for percussion, he plays a cardboard box. Man. You know, it's just so remarkable, these guys. Of course, I had a publishing deal, and part of that was that they, you know, some of the songs on this record were older demos that I had cleaned up for this project. And so those were, you know, for hire, but they typically hired people like Dave Pomeroy, who's the go-to bassist in town. Man, remarkable. We had Robert Reynolds, who was with the Mavericks at the time. He produced a few tracks for me. He produced one on here, on this current record, with I think Keith Sewell, who plays with the Chicks, is on it. Paul Deacon plays drums from the Mavericks. You know, so I don't know. I guess I've just been fortunate to surround myself with musicians, and I would say artists, because they are. They're not just musicians. These guys are artists in their own right. They hear a song, and it's important to them that they're represented as artists. I don't know that they would tell you that, but you know that they're not just not just dialing it in. I was playing this last weekend, and it was maybe my favorite show I've ever done. Lee Zimmerman, who's the journalist I mentioned earlier, invited me to come over to this thing he does called Stories and Songs. And the format of it is that Lee will talk to you between, like you play 3 songs, Lee will ask questions. Then you play 3 more, he'll ask a few more questions. It's like the James Lipton kind of thing, you know. And then the last one, he'll ask the audience if they want to ask any questions. Well, I was frankly stunned that anybody wanted to ask me anything. But I got some great questions, and one of them was, how would you define success? And for me, it's like, I'm playing to 45 people here who are interested in what I'm doing. That's success. I don't expect Taylor Swift is sweating my little record at all. And I think musicians and songwriters understand this better than anybody. If there is one person after you play that comes up and says that your song meant something to them, if it really moves somebody, that's really all that matters.